Today is a massive day within the landscape of NBA trades. Today is December 15th, which every single year in the NBA is a big deal for one particular reason. There are over 70 players that as of today are now eligible to be traded that were not eligible to be traded prior to today. Reason being, if you sign a new contract in the prior offseason, you have to wait until December 15th to be eligible to be traded. And typically, we don't see very many deals, if any at all, prior to this December 15th date. But now that it is here, now that over 70 of these players are eligible to be traded, we can take a look at some really significant, changes potentially in the landscape here around the league. And it's not necessarily the players themselves that are a big deal. In the past, we've seen, guys like Rajon Rondo get moved in December and, typically players on one-year deals. The big deal here is the salary matching, because some of these teams, the Nets, for example, have like 5, 6, 7 players that just signed one-year deals, just signed contracts in the previous offseason. And if they're not eligible to be traded, you're not working with nearly enough salary pieces and things you could possibly move. So today is a big deal. There's a couple of teams that I really want to highlight as we're getting closer to trade season here in the NBA. We're about 6-7 weeks away from the NBA trade deadline. There's a couple of teams that I really want to highlight that I would imagine are going to be pretty active. And the first team on that list for me is the Chicago Bulls. We've talked about them briefly in a couple of other videos. They are the most interesting trade team to me in the league because among the teams that I think it's realistic could trade away some pieces, could possibly look to blow it up that we weren't thinking about prior to the season, Chicago has the most interesting players potentially available in a trade because collectively, if fully healthy, Chicago is a top 6 team in the Eastern Conference, but they have not been healthy. They've not coalesced the way that they need to. And specifically, the injury to Lonzo Ball has really held them back over the last 18 months or so. And unfortunately, that's something that it doesn't appear as though is going to be fixed anytime soon. And so if you're Chicago, maybe this is an opportunity to get rid of some of these players, get some assets in exchange, and start looking a little bit more towards the future. Now, the biggest name here, of course, would be Zach LaVine, who's had some injury issues of his own throughout the season, hasn't looked particularly great at times, which maybe means that it's not a great time to go ahead and move on from him. But here's the thing. You have to make a choice if you're Chicago. Is Zach LaVine a future long-term piece? Are you going to be good again if you make some of these other roster moves in a time span that allows Zach LaVine to be a big part of that group? Or are you looking at a 2-3 year teardown here, going back to the ways of tanking and losing a ton of games? And if you're going back to that style, there's really no reason to keep Zach LaVine. He's still relatively young, but you don't want to be in a situation kind of like Washington, who we're going to talk about later, where your player that you've had here that's been good for a while, now they're like 29, they're 30, they're 31, and you still haven't really put anything around them when you could have gotten significant value prior to them, aging a little bit more. I think Zach LaVine is certainly a player to keep an eye on for a team like Dallas that we're going to talk about later. The Lakers rumors are going to be there, but what they have is just simply not enough, even given where Zach LaVine's value might be right now, which might be a little bit lower. They don't have enough, but a team that needs perimeter help, a team that needs scoring, a team that needs another guard. Again, Dallas is a team certainly that I'm keeping an eye on. Maybe they have enough to make it work, make it worthwhile for Chicago. That's a really interesting piece. But if we're ranking in terms of likelihood of players getting moved from Chicago, I think Zach LaVine is a relatively low likelihood just because I think they can convince themselves that it makes sense to keep him because he is still, pretty young. The guy that I think is much more likely is Nikola Vucevic. And it's one of those things where he hasn't been there that long and they gave up significant value. The pick that became Franz Wagner, another pick that hasn't conveyed yet, and Wendell Carter Jr. But for whatever reason, like the fit is just not there. He's a valuable guy, not the greatest defender, but can space it a little bit for you, can provide a post-up presence, can rebound. And I think for the most part, like the infrastructure that Chicago has, if fully healthy, makes sense around someone like Vucevic and someone like LaVine and someone like DeMar DeRozan, but they're not fully healthy and they don't have nearly enough defense around these guys that are typically not seen as very good defenders. And that's just an issue again when you're looking at a team like the Lakers possibly being involved, any team, Brooklyn, any team around the league that needs help at the 5 spot. I think Golden State is relatively interesting. I don't know that they'll get a ton, but Vucevic is a guy to keep an eye on. And again, someone else that I wouldn't really anticipate being moved would be DeMar DeRozan. It feels pretty quick for them to suddenly move on from that. The most likely guy, though, that I think could be traded from Chicago is Alex Caruso because he is the easiest fit within whatever you want in terms of a top tier role player on a championship team. We've already seen that in his time with the Lakers. In his time in Chicago, he's been a good defender, someone that can space the floor for you, just does a lot of good things. And again, we're thinking about teams like Brooklyn, a team like the Clippers, a team like the Lakers, any team that fancies themselves as a potential contender that needs a little bit more help on the wings, even teams that are contenders, like a team like Milwaukee or a team like Boston, Caruso would be a perfect fit, especially for a team like the Bucks. And I don't think it's going to take, multiple first round picks to get Alex Caruso, maybe a young player, maybe a pick, some kind of asset there because Chicago is just not in a position to use Alex Caruso in a way that he should be in terms of, pushing for championship contention. And that's kind of the rundown on Chicago. Now, I spoiled this a little bit earlier, but now the next team that we're going to talk about is the Washington Wizards. And there's a couple of main guys here. So Porzingis is someone that I would explore trading if I were them, because he could get hurt at any moment. Given his injury history, if his value is a little bit higher now than it was when you traded for him last year, I would explore moving him, despite the fact that he's been good for them. They're not a very good team. They're, best case scenario for them is a play-in situation. Of course, Bradley Beal is someone you're always going to keep an eye on. The problem with him is the contract and the no trade clause. So he kind of gets to pick where he wants to go, which really limits his value in terms of a trade. Something I've talked about over the last couple of months, something I talked about at the time the deal was made. But the bigger guy to me is Kyle Kuzma. I've never been a huge Kyle Kuzma guy in his time in LA, but since he's gotten to Washington, he's gotten a lot better. And similar to Caruso, although obviously plays a different position, is bigger, provides a different role. I think Kuzma's a guy that really helps, possible championship teams like Brooklyn, teams like LA, teams like Milwaukee, Boston, any of those teams that think that they are one of the top 8 teams in the league. Denver's another team. I think Kyle Kuzma could really help them. You could space the floor, he provides size, he can guard, he rebounds, a little bit of on-ball creation as well. And he needs a new contract here coming up. And so for Washington, even though he's an asset and someone I'm sure they'd like to keep around, if you're not planning on being good anytime soon, paying Kyle Kuzma, $20-25 million a year might not make the most sense. This to me feels very similar to like the Jeremy Grant situation, where he gets traded to Portland. He needs a new contract here coming up, but what the value is that he's going to provide, even though he's going to, demand a $20-25 million contract, like I think Kyle Kuzma will if he continues to play like this. It's still worth it to have a guy like that on your team. Every team in the league needs another wing. Every team in the league needs another guy that can space the floor. And Kuzma is a guy that if you're Washington and you don't want to invest that much financially in him, if you don't really know what the future direction is, he's someone that I would be interested in potentially moving if I were them, or potentially making a move for if I was one of these other teams around the league. Another team I would expect to be active is the Utah Jazz. Now, Utah got off to this really great start. They're still not bad. Like it's not like they're one of the worst teams in the league or anything, but I would guess that they want to be. And the thing for them is not only do they probably want to be one of the worst teams in the league, but they have a ton. Their whole roster is made up of guys that I think other teams around the league would be really interested in having. Mike Conley, if he's healthy, is someone that, for example, I know I keep mentioning the same teams, but like the Lakers or Brooklyn as a backup point guard, or just someone else out of Phoenix would be a perfect situation for him. Someone else out there that can guard a little bit, isn't a fantastic defender, but can run the offense, can make shots off the ball, someone that can really help you. He's someone that they should certainly explore trading. And really everybody on the roster, with the exception of a couple of young guys, are available for trade there in Utah. I think they would probably want to keep Jordan Clarkson, but he's someone that you could certainly, go out and get if you wanted to. Malik Beasley is a wing people would want. I think Jared Vanderbilt is a front court player that teams would want. And for Utah, you want to get value for these guys, but you also want to make sure that you have good draft position and give yourself an opportunity to bring in Victor Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson, because if you end up with either one of those guys in the draft as a result of trading away a couple of guys on your roster, even if you don't get maximum value for guys like Malik Beasley or Mike Conley, if you end up with the 1 or 2 pick in this draft, then the value is completely recouped and it makes total sense to trade those guys away. So another team in Utah that I think they've already done it. They traded Bogdanovich before the year. They have a ton of guys that other teams around the league, contenders, are going to be looking for, and I think they certainly would be open to making a move. And then the last team I want to talk about here is Dallas, because this is a historic situation in Dallas in terms of what they're asking from Luka on the offensive end of the floor. And without Jalen Brunson, we're really seeing just an incredible lack of playmakers in Dallas. Spencer Dinwiddie's fine when he's healthy, but he's not as good as Jalen Brunson was. Finney Smith is a fine player, but an entirely off-ball guy. Maxi Kleber, same thing. You look around the roster and it's just all these guys, yeah, they can catch the ball, they can shoot, they can guard a little bit, but Tim Hardaway Jr. is not necessarily creating a ton of offense for you. Spencer Dinwiddie's fine. And without Jalen Brunson, there's just so much Luka here, and you have to have some kind of other option. And I understand not paying Jalen Brunson. To me, that made sense. He's been good for New York, but not outstanding. And, I think it's a question whether he was worth that contract or not. But now you have to look at making some kind of move. You can't just continue to ask Luka to do everything for you, to have a historic usage rate. And the problem for them is they don't necessarily have the assets either to make a move, because the guys you would maybe look at trading away, they need Kleber, they need Dorian Finney-Smith. Josh Green is a pretty solid player for them. They'd like to keep him. The assets are just really not there for Dallas, in addition to owing some future picks. And so Zach LaVine would be a perfect fit in Dallas. I think they have the defensive infrastructure that would fit well around him and protect him a little bit defensively. And him and Luka, I think, would work well because of their ability to space. But I don't know that they necessarily have the assets to go out and get someone like that. So maybe they're the Mike Conley team. Maybe they trade, Josh Green and something else if they're willing to do that. I don't know. It's a weird situation in Dallas where Luka's so good that this is a team that made the Western Conference Finals last year. You're gonna win 45 or 50 games, even if you don't have another guy that can create for you offensively and as good as they are defensively. But he's so good that he never really allows you to be bad enough to get another offensive player alongside him, and that's desperately what they need. And the Jalen Brunson thing just unfortunately didn't work out for them. They didn't have restricted free agency for him because of the initial contract that they gave him, and that led to them losing him in free agency in a situation where they certainly would have rather kept him. So those to me are the teams we're keeping an eye on. We're going to have rumors about the Lakers and the Nets and Milwaukee and Boston and Phoenix and Denver and all these other teams that maybe see themselves as top 8, top 10 teams in the league, teams that possibly could contend. But in terms of right now, as of December 15th, teams that are increasingly more interesting as we approach trade season, these are the 4 teams I'm keeping an eye on. Of course, I'm going to make plenty more videos over the next handful of weeks, over the next 6 to 7 weeks or so, kind of rounding up all the trade rumors around the league. But today's a big day. It really changes a lot of things in terms of the dynamics that could happen, with these trades. And I'm looking forward to seeing what each of these teams potentially do.